So a few months ago, I came across a Facebook post from the BBC advertising a series of videos on Black British history and notable figures from it. There were only like 5 of these videos, but very briefly they tell stories of princes and princesses displaced by the Empire, the first black aristocrat, black Tudor porter, as well as other stories. You can tell the production is very high, but these clips don't tell you that much. There isn't a lot of information in the videos, and most are only a couple minutes long. They are, very simply put, an introduction to the fact that black people have existed in this country for centuries. The response to this is exactly what you would expect. People calling the BBC leftists, people asking why this is important, accusing the BBC of starting a race war, saying this is irrelevant, you know, typical. I felt like I had to say something, because this always happens whenever anyone talks about diversity or representation, especially Black history, women's history, and LGBT history. Why is this important? Aren't you just forcing diversity? There's a reason we don't talk about these people. And it's that final point that really made me want to say something, because there is a reason that we don't talk about these people, but it's not the reason that you might think. So I'm going to go through the top reasons why people think we don't need to talk about Black history, and why they're bullshit. Number 1. The majority of the population is white, so that's why we focus on white history. If we only cared about what the majority does, then we would only talk about what happened to the majority of the population in any given period of time. History has never cared about the majority, otherwise we wouldn't be talking about the Victorias, the Henrys, the Elizabeths of our time. We would instead be talking about the farmers, the peasants, the working class of any time point in history. Instead, we focus on those who are in power, the rich, men, white people, etc., regardless of their achievements. Really, history should be representative of people of that time. I think it's beneficial to know what life was really like for people back then. As an example, when we were learning about World War II and the Blitz, we were learning about what was the norm for normal people, for everyday people, not just the super rich or the royals, but normal people like you and me. We learn about evacuation, about air raids, about bunkers and everything like that. And that kind of stuff is useful. It's interesting. That was what life was like for the majority of the people at that time. Now, you may be saying, well, if we only focus on the majority, then we wouldn't be talking about the minorities that I'm talking about. I said representative of the population, and that means that it should be able to give you a snapshot of what life was like for those citizens, regardless of their race. A good example of what I mean is in the BBC's video on life in Roman Britain. They show a black soldier at Hadrian's Wall. It would have definitely been possible, and to be honest, fairly likely, that the Romans would have brought in soldiers from elsewhere in their empire to control the people in their new colonies. Most likely these soldiers would have come from another colonised area. There were large areas of Africa that were Roman colonies, so it would be certainly possible for a black soldier to be overseeing Roman Britain. Number 2. Race isn't relevant, so we don't need to focus on race. This one can be worded in a "you're the racist for even talking about race," but it's the same either way. It's the idea that we, as a society, are past race and, by extension, racism, and bringing it up is only doing people a disservice by focusing the conversation on race. Race is something that, in our day-to-day lives, should not be a factor. You shouldn't be noticing people's race in everything that you do, and to be honest, if you do, you're probably a racist. Or at least a bit racist. Sorry. However, there will be occasions, particularly when we're talking about history, education, and representation, where race is an important factor to discuss. Race has been used to justify the mistreatment of people of colour for years, centuries even, saying that due to their race they were inferior. And it's because of this that people would take credit for, or otherwise ignore, what minorities had achieved. When people are specifically erased from history because of their race, then yes, race is important. When we would rather paint our history in a better light by ignoring the atrocities of the empire or ignoring our role in the slave trade, then yes, race is important. There have been many, many black individuals who have fought in numerous wars for this country, who have not been mentioned, particularly in more historic battles. Soldiers from across the Commonwealth were used in both World Wars, and these would have been people who came from across the world. For centuries, the UK has had Gurkha regiments fight in wars for them, and some of them still exist to this day. And yet, when we talk about these wars, we talk almost exclusively of the white soldiers and not those who came from elsewhere to help defend us. When we talk about Romans in Britain, we talk about the white Romans, maybe the black slaves, but not the other black people who lived there either as freedmen or as normal people. When we talk about the Tudor period, we don't talk about the countless black individuals who lived and grew up in this country, just like as is mentioned in the BBC's video. We don't talk about these people, and this means that we have effectively erased them, at least in part because of their race. A good video that talks about this and how European history doesn't equal white history is this one from Sean. It is good. I would recommend. Link is in the description if you need it. Number 3. We don't talk about minor achievements, and most major achievements were made by white people. So there are a couple of points that I need to make here. Firstly, a lot of people seem to think that when we talk about diversity in education, and in history in particular, we need to be teaching about every little person and every little action, event, anything that happened. You know, that if we start talking about black individuals of the past, we need to be talking about all of them. Every single person, whether they did something or not. And that isn't how history works. Typically in history, you would discuss major events that shaped the time, or allowed certain things to happen in the future. That is why we in the UK will learn about the royals of the past. Henry VII, Henry VIII, Elizabeth I, Queen Victoria. Those individuals helped shape the world that they lived in. Henry VII reunited warring families and defeated the King of England. Henry VIII founded the Church of England. The Elizabethan era is still to this day considered Britain's golden age. You know, even Queen Victoria was extremely influential in not just her own country, but across the world. By including more diversity, it wouldn't mean that we are now going to teach about the farmer who raised the beef that Henry ate, or the seamstress that sewed Queen Victoria's morning dress. Instead, it would be mentioning those black individuals who made great achievements and were either silenced for it, or because of where they were in the world, remained unknown. It would be ensuring that we include the fact that black people have been a part of our history nearly from the start. The next point, most achievements were made by white people. Right. Now, yes, the West has made some amazing contributions to the world that we live in today. However, there are various points that I need to kind of bring up here. Now, looking back at history, there have been some great empires and many civilizations that we know very little about. There are also civilizations that created technologies that we, either in the UK or in Europe in general, would not create for hundreds, maybe even thousands years later. As an example, I'm just going to look at my iPad here so I can actually get it. The Baghdad battery was found in 1938 by a German archaeologist. The Baghdad battery could be 2,000 years old. Consists of a clay jar, a copper cylinder, and an iron rod. If filled with a weak acid, like vinegar, the combination produces around 1 volt. While even some experts refer to it as battery, its true origin and purpose remains unclear. One idea was that it was used for electroplating objects with precious metals. And that is according to the BBC science-focused magazine website. The link is in the description. this is not even accounting for, you know, things like the slave trade and the fact that statistically, you know, people of colour are more likely to be less well off than their white counterparts. And you compare a scientist who grew up in a middle class family and was given all the financial support that they needed, compared to someone who grew up, you know, very much on the poverty line, who didn't have the luxury of a fancy school, or perhaps needed to get an extra job while they were learning in order to help keep their family afloat. When you compare these two, you know, one found it much easier, and although I'm not saying that their achievements must have been then easier for them, but it would be a lot more difficult for the other person to make those same strides because they would have to go further. Hi, just a small point to add here. I'm not saying that they can't make the same achievements. I'm just saying that because they have a different starting point, you know, one has an advantage over the other. There is a video that kind of explains this really well that I will link in the description as well if you want to find out a little bit more about privilege and advantages and stuff like that. Cool, thanks. You know, when we don't look back and think about the lasting effects that the slave trade, for example, have had, we don't know what African countries would look like now if, you know, Europe hadn't taken a load of their population away from them, if the British Empire hadn't taken their resources. We don't know what their world would look like, and so it's incredible. Oh, it's just wrong to say. I don't understand why people would say that most major achievements were made by white people. Why? Oh, you're just admitting that you're ignorant. I'm sorry. One final point to mention. Regardless of what you think about the BBC or the media in general, one thing that I have noticed is whenever the BBC mentions anything to do with diversity, equality, representation, anything like that, they get a whole bunch of comments like this. Now, Black history is our history. It is a part of this country's past, present, and it will be a part of this country's future. We should be taught about important moments in history because it gives us a better idea of how we got to where we are now. Now, I live in the UK, as you may have guessed, so my experience is kind of limited to what I've learned here. We get taught about the Tudors, the Romans, medieval times. We get taught about our role in World War I and World War II. And yes, that is important, of course it is. But we should also be taught about the Commonwealth. We should be taught about the Empire's role in enslaving people and ruining countries. We should be taught about how we basically started the slave trade, but also about our own abolitionists and our own abolitionist movement within this country. These are all important moments in our country's history, and they're all moments that would probably change a lot of people's views on the place of minorities in this country. I have been told to go back to my own country from people who don't understand that this country asked for people like my mother to come here to help rebuild. I have been told that we shouldn't help refugees because they got themselves into their own mess. From people who don't understand that we had a huge hand in getting that country to the state of political unrest that it is in right now. When I hear people saying that we used to be a great empire and feel nostalgic for the good old days, it makes me feel sick because they either don't really know what that means, or even worse, they do know what that means. Teaching these parts of our history will give future generations more context for things like immigration, international conflicts, as well as actually understanding that being white, British, or European does not inherently make you better than those who aren't. Anyway, thank you for listening to this rant.